Good afternoon. Let's get started. I'm Fred Leon, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Consortium for Multicultural Psychology Research. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our 2010 Annual Distinguished Lecture in Multicultural Psychology. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Richard Nisbett, who is the Theodore M. Newcomb Distinguished University Professor at the University of Michigan, and is the first psychologist in his field in a generation to be elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Nisbett is one of the world's foremost authorities on how culture and social contexts affect thinking, perception, and behavior. In his recent book, The Geography of Thought, Professor Nisbett looks at how Asian and Westerners think differently and why. In his new book, Intelligence and How to Get It, Why Schools and Cultures Count, Dr. Nisbett challenges the prevailing idea that biology and especially genetics determine intelligence. Instead, he emphasizes the role of culture in determining intelligence. He gives new tools for understanding and fostering the kind of success for which we use intelligence as an indicator. A research professor at the Research Center for Group Dynamics at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, Dr. Nisbett also studies group decision-making, conformity, independence, and social factors affecting school performance, among other subjects. He's also received the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the American Psychological Association, as well as the William James Fellow Award from the American Psychological Society. The title of his presentation is Intelligence and How to Get It, Nature, Nurture, and Neurons. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Nisbett. You need to turn on your...
Thank you. Well, I'm very honored to be asked to give this lecture. It's the only one I'm aware of in the field of psychology. And very happy to be here. Sorry to bring the bad weather, though, that's coming tomorrow. I hope you won't blame me for the ending our streak here. Well, you may wonder what culture has to do with intelligence. And to get a bit ahead of myself, my answer to that is everything. Everything. And I'm going to be talking today about a large number of misconceptions. They're about intelligence. There are two ways to get these misconceptions about intelligence. One is by failure to read psychologists on the topic, and the other is by reading psychologists on the topic. First misconception is that intelligence is basically one thing. It's your IQ score, or some people prefer G, which is an optimal weighting of subtests on IQ scores so as to maximally correlate with the central factor that comes out when you analyze a battery of IQ subtests. That fluid G, or the ability to solve novel, abstract problems, is the core of intelligence. The heritability of IQ is very high, 0.6 to 0.8. Environmental differences contribute little to IQ. IQ simply unfolds in anything like a normal environment. As a result, family environment is not very important. Early childhood education doesn't work to improve intelligence, and school makes a little difference to intelligence. There has been substantial dysgenesis. That means we're getting less intelligent because lower SES people have lower IQ and more children than middle class and upper middle class people, so the overall intelligence of the population is declining. The difference in IQ between the social classes is growing. And final misconceptions, blacks' IQ has been 15 points lower than whites for the past 80 years. The main reason for that is genetics. Asians have higher IQs than whites, and the main reason for that is genetic. And there's a policy implication of all of this, which is we should save time and money. Don't attempt to raise intelligence because it's doomed to failure, especially the intelligence of lower SES people and minorities. Just in case you doubt that I'm actually capturing mainstream views on intelligence, this is Sandra Scar, an intelligence expert, but the quotes here could have come from any number of people. The child's genes determine his or her phenotype, and the child's environment is merely a reflection of the characteristics of both parents and child. That is to say, what your intelligence is, or anything else about you, what you've ended up being, is just a reflection of the genetic characteristics of both parents and child. The child's environment is going to be superior if it's born to superior IQ parents, but that's because of genetics. The superior IQ parents are passing on their intelligence to their kids via their genes, and it's just incidental that the environment is also superior. Parental differences in rearing styles, social class, and income have small effects on the measurable differences in intelligence. Well, let's talk a bit about the types of intelligence. IQ tests basically measure analytic intelligence. And analytic intelligence tests are characterized by having a certain type of item, which typically all of the information you need to solve the problem is present in the statement of the problem. There typically is only one solution. Typically there's not a great deal of intrinsic interest in the problem. This is to be contrasted with other kinds of intelligence which have scarcely been looked at, but they include practical intelligence. Robert Sternberg is the primary person who's studied practical intelligence and creativity, and he's able to show that practical intelligence and creativity predict school success and predict career success to a substantial degree, and despite the fact that both of these are almost independent of IQ tests, type IQ. Social intelligence is another type of intelligence that I don't doubt exists, but there's not really much evidence for it other than the fact that there are people with substantial pathologies, for example, autism, who are clearly very low in what we would have to call social intelligence. Another way of measuring intelligence is by academic achievement. Now, obviously, academic achievement depends on more than just intelligence, however you construe it. It's based on also on motivation and self-control. Occupational attainment is another way of measuring intelligence. Higher occupational attainment is indicative of higher intelligence. Job ratings are also correlated with IQ. But almost all of the data pertain to IQ and academic achievement, and that's why that's all I'm going to be talking about today, because almost all of the other data is scanty and is only tangentially related to the main event. Okay, how about heritability? First of all, it's not close to 0.8. The effect of the family environment is substantial, and the reason that the standard position in the intelligence field is that these things, that heritability is close to 0.8 and the family environment effect is not very great, is due to errors. They're perfectly understandable errors, but they're errors. So it turns out that identical twins who are reared apart, their correlation between their IQs is in the range of 0.75 to 0.8. And the logic here goes, well, look, if they're reared apart, the environments are different. The environments are not going to be able to produce what the similarities between them. It can only be genes that's producing the similarities between them. But that's actually quite mistaken, because typically identical twins who are reared apart are reared in the same town, often by relatives, often go to the same school. And when you look at environments that actually do differ substantially, something like the degree of what you'd get if you dropped these twins randomly on U.S. environments, if you get that degree of average difference, the correlation goes way down to the vicinity of 0.35, 0.4. And in any case, the similarities between twins are a function of shared environmental experiences that are common to identical twins. To give an example of what this is one of the most important points I want to make, give an example of why this is true. Consider two identical twins, Bob and Bill, and they're both a little taller than average, or they're both a little stronger than average, or both a little faster than average, or both a little better coordinated than average. It's some kind of difference that would tend to set them in for good store for basketball. These kids are going to have relatively similar experiences with basketball because of this perhaps slight genetic difference with respect to a single characteristic, which is certainly not the whole of basketball playing talent. But they're going to resemble one another in basketball playing, and the way genetic analysis goes you would have to say that, that basketball ability is substantially inherited. But that's not the way to think about it at all. What's inherited is some, perhaps relatively narrow trait that leads people to have similar experiences with respect to basketball. And the same thing can be true in the case of intelligence. A small advantage with respect to curiosity or willingness to work hard could cause identical twins to have relatively similar experiences, to get more involved with their education, to be rewarded more for it, and so on. So in any case, the environment is essential for anything to happen. I mean, the genes by themselves are not going to produce results. It's only in combination with the environment. Here's another way that the assessment comes out that IQ is substantially genetically determined. If you look at the IQs of adopted children and you then see how well these IQs correlate with those of their birth parents or with those of the adoptive parents, what you find is the correlation is much better with the birth parents than with the adoptive parents. And the logic goes, well, look, it's the birth parents who are determining the IQ here, so that shows that the IQ is largely genetic. The adoptive parents is not producing a big correlation, and therefore the role of the environment is relatively slight. Perfectly reasonable way to go about your business and to make inferences. It's just quite wrong, because adoptive families are like Tolstoy's happy families. They're all alike. They're highly favorable environments, and they don't differ that much from each other. And that's why you can't get much of a correlation between adoptive kids' IQ and the adoptive parents' IQ, because the environments differ very little, and if the environments differ very little, they can't be very well correlated with their adoptive children's IQ. You can get out of the whole correlation business, though, which we always try to do in psychology, by just thinking of adoption as an experiment. What's the effect on a kid's IQ of being adopted? And most kids who are adopted are kids who are lower SES, and they're typically adopted into higher SES, middle or higher SES families. So what's the effect of that experiment on IQ? And the answer is it's about a standard deviation. 12 to 18 points is what adoption is worth on average. To give you an idea of what this means, just to remind you what that standard deviation is 15 IQ points. That's just by tradition that you set the standard deviation of IQ tests at 15 points. The difference between 15 points is the difference between being at the 50th percentile and the 84th percentile, between being average and being bright. Or it's the difference between the 84th percentile and the 98th percentile, the difference between being bright and being super bright. So these are massive effects of being adopted and indicate massive effects of the environment. There's no such thing as the value for heritability. It's recognized in genetics that heritability is totally dependent on population characteristics, and in the case of human IQ, heritability is completely dependent on social class. It's in fact very high for upper middle class people, in the range of 0.7 to 0.8, and it's in the range of 0.10 to 0.2 for lower SES people. Now, why might this be? Well, because upper middle class families, like those adoptive families, are all alike. They're giving extremely good environments to their children. And there probably isn't much difference between the environment that Dr. Smith and his family give to their children as compared to Lawyer Jones and her family. So there's not much difference among them. Heritability, genetics, is going to determine all the variation in that subpopulation. But for lower SES families, they're going to range from as good as you would ever find in any upper middle class family in terms of the environment offered for the children to disruptive and chaotic in every respect. When you have huge environmental variation, you can't have much contribution by genes. So there's no real mystery about this if you think about these differences in those terms. But notice how optimistic this is for their ability to be able to raise the IQ of lower SES people if the heritability is so low and the environment is producing such a huge effect. If you change the environment, you also have the room to have a huge effect on intelligence. And notice that there's actually a social class confound in twin studies of heritability. If you look at the graphs of how heritability increases from children to youth to older teenagers to adulthood, you'll see that there's a steady increase in the apparent heritability of IQ with a huge jump up to adult IQ. Very strange graphs. I mean, no graphs look like that. A whole bend exactly as you go from 18 to adulthood, why you would ever find such a steep inflection point. And I believe the reason for that is that there's a social class confound in twin studies of heritability. When you study heritability in populations up to 18, you're looking at school populations, you're looking at basically a representative sample of the U.S. But when you look at adults, you're looking largely at middle and upper middle class people. That's because if you've ever tried to get lower SES people into the lab to test them, you know it's a difficult thing to do. They're just much less likely to do it for whatever reason. But this means that your lower SES people who drag down the overall population level for heritability are not represented in those adult samples, and so you're getting an overestimate of the degree of heritability for adults. Finally, even very high heritability has no implications for modifiability. Let me say that again more emphatically. Even very high heritability has no implications for modifiability. This is not a matter for debate among geneticists. It's recognized as axiomatic. Here's how you can think about it, though. Imagine that we set up identical circumstances for a set of plants, exactly the same soil circumstances, exactly the same temperature, exactly the same light exposure, absolutely everything is identical. If that's the case and they differ in size, the only way that that can possibly be true, given the way I've set up the terms of this problem, is through genetics. So the genetics is producing all of the variability. But imagine that we take, instead of this some kind of average level of environment here, imagine that we improve the environment in every possible way, give exactly the best nutrients, exactly the best exposure to light. We pray over them, we play Mozart to them, and you're going to have a huge effect on the size of those plants. But again, by the terms of the problem, the environment is identical. You have a huge determination of the height of those plants as a result of genes, but there's no the difference between these two sets of plants is entirely environmental. Huge difference, all environment. Or you can go the other way and give these poor plants a terrible environment. You get the same thing. Substantial variation, all due to genetics, but the difference between populations, between treatment conditions, entirely due to the environment. Well, let's talk for a minute about what the subtests of the WISC look like, because they're going to be important for us to understand some of the cultural contributions to intelligence. First, there is a batch. The WISC test has 10 subtests. 5 of them are generally considered to be crystallized intelligence. Crystallized means it's what you know, what you carry around with you. You've maybe had some effort in learning this stuff, but you've now basically got it, and it's there in your memory and on tap for solving problems. So this includes information, vocabulary, comprehension, which doesn't mean paragraph comprehension. It means comprehension of the way the world works. So why are addresses on a street numbered consecutively? Or for somewhat older kids, why are revenge and forgiveness alike? That would be for the similarities test. And arithmetic, or for young kids, be very simple problems like that one. For older kids, much more complicated. And fluid intelligence subtests. For these tests, there isn't much information that you have in the past that's going to help you much with this. This is more on-the-spot reasoning, often with very abstract materials, and they include things like picture completion. You show people a picture that something is missing, and can you identify that? Arrange pictures in an order so that they'll tell some kind of sensible causal story, or use blocks to replicate a design, or object assembly, assemble puzzles that depict common objects, and coding, just using a key to match symbols with shapes or numbers, which is basically a speed measure. And it turns out that these two things, well, first of all, let me consider what is considered to be the gold standard in IQ testing of a culture-free IQ test is the Raven progressive matrices task. So you have along the top, these are figures that are differing from one another. It's considered culture-free because everybody's seen circles and squares and diamonds. So you look at the nature of the alteration of these figures across the top. So it's the upper left-hand quadrant that's filled in, then it's the upper right-hand quadrant, and now both of those quadrants are filled in. So you know how to fill in the second one. That's also obvious. And now the question is, how do you complete this line on the bottom, given what you've seen previously and what the transformation rule is for the rows above. In case you're having trouble with that, I'll point it out. It's that one. Okay. It turns out that fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence are completely different things. They are separate components of analytic intelligence with little association between the two at a causal level. Fluid intelligence declines with age, but crystallized intelligence increases with age. This is crystallized intelligence. It keeps on increasing up into very old age. This is fluid intelligence, which, how many people are under 20 here? Oh, congratulations, you're at your peak. Everybody else is over the hill. In my case, when you reach my age, you will have lost more than a standard deviation of fluid intelligence. But I don't miss it. I'm only partly kidding. There actually is a mystery of how people can be 70 years old, missing so much fluid intelligence, and function as well as they do. Not always, but in many cases. There's actually lots of people working on this problem now. Another way to understand these differences is that the prefrontal cortex is activated by fluid intelligence test. So when that's the middle front of the brain, and when you work on something like the Raven progressive matrices, that area lights up. And as you might expect, given these two facts, that fluid intelligence declines particularly with age, and the prefrontal cortex is activated by fluid intelligence, the prefrontal cortex deteriorates particularly badly with age. And that's undoubtedly the causal factor underlying this decay. Lesions to the prefrontal cortex damage fluid intelligence, but they can leave crystallized intelligence completely intact. This is so extreme that you can have someone with an IQ corresponding to 100 on crystallized IQ tests, but that same person can be 2 standard deviations below the mean in fluid intelligence. And you could know such a person, and you would not know, unless you gave them Raven progressive matrices, you would not know that they were disastrously lacking in fluid intelligence. You can go the other way around too. You can have extremely low crystallized intelligence, as we have in autism, but normal or superior fluid intelligence. And stress affects the prefrontal cortex, and this is very important for later purposes today because lower SES people and minorities have much more stress. Stress knocks out the PFC acutely. That is, if you're under acute stress, you can't do that Raven progressive matrices type test very well, but it also has a long-term effect. Stress over the long term affects the effectiveness of functioning of the prefrontal cortex over the long term, and there are big class differences in stress. And finally, we're finding out now that in the last couple, 3 years, several different research groups have shown that there are different kinds of computer exercises which can train fluid intelligence. There are also exercises that will improve crystallized intelligence, that's namely education. Okay, are we getting less intelligent over time? Actually, if anything, we're getting much more intelligent. There's something called the Flynn effect, discovered by James Flynn. There's been a massive IQ increase in recent decades. In fact, a massive IQ increase since IQ first began being tested at the beginning of the 20th century. Over the 55-year period, 1947 to 2002, it increased 10 points, the equivalent of 10 points for crystallized subtests, the equivalent of 20 points for fluid subtests, and almost 2 standard deviations on the culture-free Raven test. The Raven is not culture-free. The Raven is drenched in culture. As a matter of fact, one of the things I've gotten convinced of as I've been studying intelligence is there can be no such thing as a culture-free intelligence test. It's not a possibility. What does this mean for our understanding of what IQ is? It's really impossible that we've gained more than a standard deviation in actual intelligence in 55 years. And if you go back to 1917, when IQ first started being tested in the U.S., there's a 2 standard deviation, nearly a 2 standard deviation gain in IQ. Well, we certainly have not increased 2 standard deviations in intelligence as God sees it. I don't know how she sees it, but we have not increased by 2 standard deviations. If you keep projecting that backwards, I mean, Aristotle must have been swinging from trees. I mean, however, the gains on skills tested by the WACE and the WISC tests are certainly real. People with larger vocabularies are smarter. And smarter people tend to have higher vocabularies. People who can comprehend the way the world works better. A kid who can tell you why it is that doctors go back for more education is smarter than a kid who can't tell you that. So these gains are quite real. In the case of adults in vocabulary, the gain is a standard deviation during that period. Well, the question arises as to why. Well, volumes have been written speculating on what causes this. We don't know. The bottom line is we don't really know. The top line is we do know in a sort of a general, vague way what's causing it. It's almost certainly the Industrial Revolution and the Information Revolution that have put pressure on what it is that people need to know in order to be smart and function in a society. And the society has risen to that challenge in whatever way. That's a very vague way of talking about it, but almost surely that's the way to understand it at the top level. At a lower level, it's just speculation. TV probably contributes, at least in the last 50 or 60 years. I Love Lucy was a terrific show, but you weren't going to learn any new vocabulary from watching it, and it had a single simple plot line. Many TV shows now have multiple plot lines, and I'm often amazed at the vocabulary words that you can pick up from TV. Computer games, as we mentioned before, we now know some kinds of computer games improve fluid intelligence. And there's a raven. Why might ravens be getting better? Well, it's somehow education is emphasizing more and more abstract materials, working over completely abstract materials. If you have no experience with that, you're going to do very badly. A study was done in Africa giving school kids, looking at kids when they began school, ravens, performance on Raven progressive matrices. After 2 or 3 months of normal schooling, their ability to solve Raven progressive matrices had increased by a standard deviation. So there's something about school that's teaching something about how to work with abstract materials that's causing that IQ gain. Well, how about the schools? The school contribution to IQ is enormous. You can look at, think of the following test, which has actually been done. Jane can enter school in the fall because she was born on July 31st. Joan was born on August 1st and can't enter school in the fall. So now we can look at the end of the year, how much do these kids differ? And the answer is that Joan, or whichever one I said who got to go to school, is a year ahead. It's a full standard deviation ahead in IQ tests of the girl who didn't get to go to school. Well, what can be done to make school better? How can we make ourselves and our kids smarter? First of all, let's talk for a minute about some things that don't matter. Vouchers, where you give people money that they can take to any school, parochial school, public school, private school. There's no evidence that that increases that kid's academic achievement. Most charters, with some extremely important exceptions, which I'll talk about later, don't seem to be very effective. When they start out, they tend to be a little bit worse. Maybe after they've been in operation for a while, they're a little bit better than the regular public schools. But fortunately, I should get ahead of myself, the Obama administration knows what kinds of charter schools are effective, and that's where they're putting their money. Higher degrees are no indication that a teacher is going to be better. Whole school interventions where you go in and you change the curriculum and you give teacher training and you change the textbooks and so on. These kinds of interventions tend to be very expensive and they're not very effective, maybe 0.1 standard deviations. Very bad bucks, very bad bang for the buck. So what does matter? First of all, the individual teacher, especially that first grade teacher. To give you an idea of how important this is, you can look at a kid who's expected in kindergarten, who's expected to do poorly in school because that kid has parents with low education levels. And if that kid gets a teacher who's judged to be in the bottom third of instructional effectiveness, that kid in fact is going to have problems throughout school. If that kid goes to a first grade classroom with a teacher who's judged to be in the top third of instructional effectiveness, that kid is going to function essentially at middle class levels. So the difference that the teacher, especially that first grade teacher, makes is massive. Class size has an effect, but you have to manipulate over a large range, so like 16 or 18 to 26 or 28 kids in a room. That's very expensive. That's worth about a third of a standard deviation, more than that for minority kids than for majority kids. But it's extremely expensive, and I don't think it's the best bang for the buck. Various forms of computerized instruction produce a big impact on reading, on math, and on science. I mean, there are claims made for these programs, and it looks like to me the research is good, but I don't want to report the standard deviation gains because they're really huge for these things. I'm a little bit dubious, but I don't doubt that there are some kinds of computerized instruction which can add a lot to what goes on in the classroom. And finally, there's various kinds of cooperative learning. The first person I know of to do this, and I believe the person who invented the whole thing, was a social psychologist, Elliot Aronson, who invented something called the jigsaw classroom, where each person has a different piece of the puzzle. Each kid has a different piece, and they have to get together to each kid who brings something to the party is necessary before the class can get, or the group can achieve their assignment. On this slide, I'll point out that for school contribution, of course, their learning academic achievement is way higher after you've been in school for a year versus not being in school for a year, but actual IQ is also higher. The rest of the dependent variables that I'm talking about, until I get to the bottom, again, are all academic achievement variables. And the final thing I want to talk about in terms of school improvement is the Venezuela project. And the Minister for Education of Venezuela approached a number of researchers at Harvard and said, I'd like to make kids in Venezuela smarter. Can you do that? And they started with 7th graders, and they taught these kids things that are, these things are not taught in schools. I mean, they in any kind of a formal way. Classification, hypothesis testing, this is the 7th graders, logical argumentation, analyzing analogies, inductive inference. These are things that really make you smarter. And there was a gain over the course of the year of 0.4 to 0.8 standard deviations on these kinds of targeted skills, and a gain of 6.5 IQ points at the end of 1 year. Now, there are two amazing things about this study. The first is that no one has ever attempted to replicate it. I don't know what education researchers are doing with themselves. It's more important than this, but no one's ever attempted to replicate it. And the other amazing thing about it is that the lead author on this was Richard Herrnstein, who then wrote a book called The Bell Curve, which argued all of these misconceptions which I started with. So he's shown that at school can have a massive effect on IQ if you improve it, and he writes a book saying the environment makes no difference to IQ. I have no way to explain that. All right, the differences between social classes. Are they getting larger? No. If anything, they're shrinking. What could impede further shrinking? What could prevent the social classes from coming closer together over time? First of all, genes. There's always going to be at least a slight genetic contribution to the difference between the social classes, because there are two ways of increasing your social class. One is by having good genes, the other is by having a good environment. So to some degree, there's always going to be a transmission from higher SES to their children who's going to have an advantage for higher SES, both because of the environment they've grown up in and because of the genetics on average. But that difference between the social classes is not large. The difference between the middle of the top third of SES and the middle of the bottom third of SES is only 10 points. And we know a huge range of things that have biological causes and environmental causes that are operating to produce these differences. So there are things like fetal alcohol syndrome, which differ between lower and higher SES kids, lead poisoning, insecticide poisoning, health care, asthma, which has a big impact on school performance, and breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is worth about 6 points on IQ. The difference here is very substantial. Used to be very substantial. It's less now, fortunately, between middle class and lower class mothers on the likelihood of breastfeeding their children. Then there are environmental causes which are not biological in the first instance, but some of which do have biological effects. First of all, there's stress and PFC-mediated fluid in IQ functioning. Just to take one source of stress for lower SES kids, there are schools in this country where the turnover from the beginning of the year to the end of the year is 100%, the average turnover. Now imagine how disruptive that is for a kid, a new kid sitting next to him every week. He's been introduced to a new school where he's completely behind the 8 ball because he hasn't had material presented that is necessary for understanding what he's doing now, or the reverse. He's sitting listening to it for the umpteenth time, stuff he already knows. It's going to make him bored and disengaged. There's a drop over the summer in IQ overall, for kids overall. For the lower fifth of kids in IQ, the drop is substantial. For the highest fifth in socioeconomic status, there's an actual gain over the summer. So we know that what's going on in the homes and the environments of these higher SES families is having a huge impact on IQ. And the schools are often blamed for a lot of things, but notice that the schools, what I just said about the summer drop means that the schools are making a huge contribution to reducing the difference between the social classes. Because when you drop to school, you drop the IQ of the lower SES kids. Finally, we know a lot of differences in parental socialization. None of these can be given a causal estimate of exactly how important they are. In fact, I can't even make a confident statement that these things are causally important, but they sure seem like they would be. For example, talking to kids. Upper middle class families have kids who at the age of 3 have heard 30 million words. Working class families at the age of 3, their kids have heard 20 million words. The preparation for schooling is enormously different. We're all middle class here, or upper middle class, some of you I suppose. You just automatically, you teach your kids things without even thinking about it. It just sort of comes with the territory. You read as soon as in my case, as soon as you can prop up the 6-month-old in front of a book, you start reading to him. Just know you should do that. You teach kids how to categorize, classify things just in the ordinary routine of going through the day. You teach the kids how to analyze problems, how to evaluate things, all of which stands them in very good stead, especially in later elementary school. And there's a huge difference in social classes between how much encouragement a kid gets and how many reprimands a kid gets. In upper middle class families, the kid gets 6 encouragements. That's really swell, Billy. That's great. Now, you tried hard on that. per one in reprimand. Don't do that. Stop. Cut that out. The ratio is 2 to 1 for lower SES families. Again, I can't tell you that I know for sure that any of these things are causally important, but it would be very strange if they weren't, although we have no idea in what proportion they're important. Okay, black-white differences in IQ. I'll point out, first of all, if you're interested in looking at all the indirect tests that have been done that have led people to believe that there are genetic differences between blacks and whites, all those indirect tests, I have an entire chapter and an entire appendix in my book with the same title as this talk. If you're interested in tracking that down, the evidence is weak, it's easily refuted. And we have lots of forms of direct evidence. That direct test of heritability comes from natural experiments. The black population in the U.S. has 20% European genes. That means that any given black person can have somewhere between 100% African genes and mostly European genes. Now, if European genes are superior, it's just got to be the case that those blacks with more European genes are smarter than those with largely or exclusively African genes. Someone's done a study with the very smartest kids and the black kids in the Chicago school system. Kids with IQs above 140, genius level IQs, and then looked at the heritage of these kids. Is there any more European heritage for the kids with these high IQs than for the population as a whole? And the answer is no. Or you can do blood group studies. You can assess someone's degree of Africanness versus Europeanness by blood groups, because different blood group types differ very substantially across the continents. So you can get a very strong bead on how European a given black is. None of these blood group tests shows any advantage at all to having European genes. And a somewhat different experiment comes from World War II. Lots of GIs, US GIs, had children with German women. And when these kids were 7 years old, their IQs were tested. Now, you might think that there would be a substantial social disadvantage for those black kids, because for no other reason that there would be prejudice against the kid, because the society knows that that mother has given birth to an illegitimate child, since nearly all of these births to GIs were illegitimate. If the kid's white, you can't know that. If the kid's black, you would know that. And if there's any other racial prejudice that's going on, you'd think their IQs would be lower. In fact, the IQs of the white kids in this study were 97. The IQs of the black kids were 96.5. Even with an N of several hundred, it was not significant. And finally, there are two studies, one of them by Sandra Scarr and another study by a woman named Moore, where you look at black kids and mixed race kids who are adopted. The Sandra Scarr study was flawed in many, many different ways. And to her credit, she admitted the severe flaws in that study. The data were consistent with, on the face of it, consistent with the genetic contribution to the black-white difference. But the black kids, for example, an error in the design, the black kids were adopted 2 years later on average than the white kids, and range of adoption is substantially correlated with IQ. In any case, the one by Moore had no such, so far as I can tell, no such flaws. The author didn't point out any. I can't find any. And the black and mixed race kids, that is, kids with parents, one black and one white parent, had identical IQs raised in these adopted families. Well, if that's true, there's no genetic contribution to this difference. Why is the difference in IQ still 15 points? And it isn't. It's 9.5 points now. There's been a steady gain over the last 30 or 40 years of black IQ and white IQ. Both are getting smarter, or at least getting higher IQs, but the rate of gain is substantially higher for blacks than for whites. Black IQ now is about what white IQ was in 1960. The National Assessment of Education and Progress, if you look at reading and math scores of kids over approximately that same period of time, roughly the early 1970s to now, they've also decreased by about 1/3 of a standard deviation. So both measures that we have of intelligence indicate a closing of the gap. Well, what will impede further gap reduction between blacks and whites? First of all, there are the structural factors that we're all perfectly aware of. History of racism, condition of poverty, which can be difficult to get out of, job discrimination. People are sometimes shocked to know how much job discrimination there still is at entry-level jobs. One study gives employers, some employers, an application by a white applicant that is identical to the application that's given to other employers of a white applicant, what did I say first? Some get the white applicant, some get the identical material with a black applicant. The only difference between the two is that the white has had a felony conviction on his record. The white is more likely to get the interview, even under those circumstances. There are environmental factors that are toxic for lower SES people in general, which are even worse on average for blacks, lower SES blacks. And there are anti-achievement black subcultures, both in the inner city and in suburban high schools, which are highly integrated. Often there's a taunt that you're trying to act white if you achieve in school. Daphne Oyserman at the University of Michigan has studied school grades of kids in the inner city of Detroit and found a correlation between skin color and school grades such that the darker this kid's skin, the higher the grades. And what she argues is the only plausible way to explain this is that if you have very dark skin, it doesn't sound like such a plausible accusation that you're trying to act white, since you haven't got much chance of achieving that. Stereotype threat is important. We know to actual test scores under certain kinds of circumstances. And stereotype threat, where you're afraid of confirming with your own behavior and your own outcomes a stereotype about your group, in this case a stereotype of low intelligence, can cause people to disidentify with a system where they are at risk. If I don't try, then I don't have to face the possibility that I'm not right. I don't have to face the possibility that this stereotype applies to me. Again, we don't know to what degree stereotype threat is causal. To me, it seems highly plausible that it does have a substantial impact on keeping black kids away from attempting achievement as much as they might. We know that there are big neighborhood, peer, and family effects, but we know that for a fact. That comes from what I just was talking about with the genetic contributions. The only other contributions that exist are neighborhood, school, peer, and family. We can ask now, what is the effect of adoption of blacks by middle-class blacks or middle-class whites? Where the middle-class blacks are going to have, on average, worse neighborhoods than the middle-class whites. And the answer is that's worth 13 points on the IQ of a kid. These kids have been adopted essentially randomly into either black families or white families. The kid in the middle-class white family has an IQ of 13 points higher than that of the middle-class black. If you look at offspring of black-white unions where either the mother is white or the mother is black, those cases where the mother is white, the kid has an IQ 9 points higher than if the mother is black. That doesn't prove that what goes on in the home is a part of this, but it strongly suggests to me that a part of the difference is something that's going on in the home that's on top of social class. And the way I understand that is generals prepare for the last war, and parents socialize their children for the occupations that their parents had. Anyway, we do know that there are parental socialization differences. If you look at inner city black kids, they've heard 10 million words to the 20 million words that a working class kid has heard and the 30 million words that the upper middle class kid has heard. There are many fewer stimulating materials in the home. The ratio of encouragements to reprimand is 1 to 2, not 2 to 1 or 6 to 1, but 1 to 2. And the effect sizes on these socialization differences are ranged between small and moderate across a substantial range of socialization differences. Well, can we reduce the social class and black-white gaps in intelligence and academic achievement? First thing you might think of is Head Start. Actually, Head Start wasn't established to reduce academic achievement differences or IQ differences between lower SES kids and higher SES kids. It was basically just organized to improve the health of kids, and it's done that. Kids who are in Head Start do have better health outcomes, not significantly different from the population as a whole, as a matter of fact. Head Start does produce a half a standard deviation IQ gain or so by early elementary school. Those gains are gone. The long-term effects are probably slight, though we don't know. Despite the billions and billions of dollars that have been spent on Head Start, we have no idea what the long-term effects of Head Start are. However, we do know that there are several highly effective programs that do have a huge impact of initial IQ gains of as much as 20 points, as much as 5 points of that difference remaining at adolescence, and absolutely massive effects on achievements of kids. A reduction by half of the likelihood of repeating a grade, a reduction by half of the likelihood of being put in a special education class, an increase by 30% in the likelihood of graduating from high school, an increase of 30% of the likelihood of going to college, a huge difference in income resulting from these things. So even though there is very significant IQ gain, the effects on achievement remain massive. Some people think this is because these things probably have a bigger impact on self-control than they do on IQ. I'm not so convinced. I think that it depends on whether what you would expect in these cases depends on whether you think the mind is like clay or like muscle. If you think mind is like clay, say, well, whatever happens early, that forms the kid, and that's the way the kid's going to be throughout life. If you think that a mind is like a muscle, you wouldn't be surprised that the kid loses IQ, even though he's been in an accelerated program early on, any more than you would be surprised if somebody exercised with weights for a couple of years and got much stronger, and 10 years later he spent the whole time on the couch and he's no longer strong. You wouldn't want to say, well, that shows that exercise is not effective. So this raises the question, what would happen if you continued the intervention? There are several interventions that we have now that are absolutely massive for minority, low SES kids. One is, there are many like this now. One, the best known is the Knowledge is Power program, or KIP. KIP their clientele is entirely poor black and Hispanic kids. These kids spend 60% more time in school than you did when you were in school. And it's not just drill and kill, as the educators say. It's sports, music. Every kid gets a musical instrument to play. Museums, theater. They basically have upper middle class experiences in addition to school. Someone has done a study, the Stanford Research Institute has done a study of all the San Francisco area schools. If you look at the effects of 1 year in 5th grade, kids switching from the public schools to KIP, 25% at the beginning of the year are over the 50th percentile, 44% at the end of 1 year, 37% above the 50th percentile at the beginning of the year, 65% above national averages at the end of 1 year of the 5th grade. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Jaime Escalante, the claim that he was able to get East Los Angeles barrio kids to pass the AP calculus exam at rates higher than any upper middle class kid in Los Angeles. And there's good news and bad news about that. The good news is it's perfectly true. He did get that level of achievement. The bad news is he didn't just waltz in on the first day of class in the senior year and say, we're going to take the top off the AP calculus exam. He started those kids at the beginning of middle school and enriched math classes and kept it up through the senior year. So you can do it. It's not as easy as the movie implies, but it's no longer open to doubt as to whether you can take inner city minority kids and get them to function at a substantially higher level than the population as a whole if you give them the right kind of education. College by itself is a big gap reducer, incidentally. High school is a disaster for most black kids. They start out 3/5 of a standard deviation lower in IQ, and by the end of high school, they're a full standard deviation lower in IQ. But those same kids, if starting out in college, standard deviation separates them at the beginning of college. At the end of college, it's only 2/5 of a standard deviation. So college itself has a huge impact on not just on academic achievement, of course, but also on IQ. Last, I'll talk about some interventions that I'm very proud of because they're done by social psychologists. Carol Dweck has just tried to convince middle school kids that intelligence is malleable by showing them pictures of dendrites going together as you learn. And she reports that some of her tough junior high kids cry when you convince them that their intelligence is substantially under their control. It's worth 1/3 of a grade point to do that for kids. Josh Aronson has found bigger effects than that. 0.5 standard deviations in reading for just telling the kids that their IQ is under their control to a substantial extent, and a full standard deviation in math for females. Daphne Oyserman has gone into inner city public schools and has just tried to get kids to have a more positive academic self, to understand what it is they've got to do in order to be as successful as they want to be. They want to be successful for the most part. What she does is to say, where do you want to be 10 years from now? What do you want to achieve? What do you think you're going to have to do to get there? Who do you think would be helpful in getting there? What kind of barriers do you think they're going to be put in your way? How would you get around those barriers? That's worth 1/4 of a standard deviation in grades, 0.33 standard deviations in standardized tests, and 0.6 on the likelihood of retention in grade. Jeffrey Cohen has done the most amazing study. He simply has middle school kids on the first day, high school kids on the first day of high school, first few days of high school, write about their most important value. That erases 40% of the black-white difference in a mixed-race high school. Now, nobody exactly knows why that is. There are a lot of people who doubt whether that can be true. I don't. I've reviewed the paper. I'm confident that it was well done. I have confidence in him. Something about, maybe it's tying your own concerns to something about the school, that the school cares about what your values are. Who knows? But, and it's been replicated now. Cohen, along with Greg Walton, has at a prestigious private school, a lot of all kids when they start in college. Am I going to fit in here? Am I going to have friends? They're scared about that. Minority kids, it's much worse. There are not that many of us here. Am I going to find friends? Am I going to belong here? So they simply have upperclassmen say, you know, when I got here, I was really worried. Was I going to be able to fit in? Would I have friends? And now, you know, it's been fine. I have lots of friends. I felt like this is really where I belong. So you hear testimonials from seniors. That's worth a standard. That's worth a standard deviation on GPA. And Claude Steele at the University of Michigan created the 21st Century program. Won't go into the details of that, but it was worth 1/3 of a letter grade for peanuts. These things cost nothing. They cost nothing. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to go into a school and give new curricula and teacher training and so on to get a 0.1 standard deviation. These people are getting significant fractions of a standard deviation for nothing. Nothing. Okay, the last topic I want to discuss is there an advantage for Asians in native intelligence? We don't know, but what evidence we have is against it. There's a study done by comparing kids at the beginning of school, first grade and fifth grade, in Taiwan, Japan, and the US. Now, as I've just said, testing IQ cross-culturally is a very difficult matter, though it's less problematic in some ways for fluid intelligence than for crystallized intelligence. In any case, the East Asian kids had lower IQ, significantly lower IQ than the US kids at the outset of school. If you know about East Asian family socialization, it's not surprising. Westerners focus a lot on intellectual goals in raising kids before school. It's much more likely to be socio-emotional goals that are sought after. by East Asian parents. In any case, the IQ differences were gone by 5th grade, but by that point the Taiwanese were way ahead of the American kids in math, and the Japanese kids were 1.3 standard deviations ahead of the American kids by 5th grade, and it just gets worse for us from there. Another study is also extremely suggestive. They looked, this is from the famous Coleman report. All of the kids of the high school class, not all of the kids, but a huge sample, tens of thousands of kids in the high school class, graduating class of 1966 were studied with all kinds of batteries of tests and attitude questionnaires, all kinds of personality, everything. The SATs of the Asian American kids in that class, all of them were at least first generation, some second, some up to fourth generation, fifth generation American. Very slightly lower in IQ, nothing of any significance, but very slightly different in IQ. But the Asian kids, the Chinese American kids in particular, 0.3 standard deviations ahead on the SAT score. So they are transforming that, whatever that IQ score is, into a much higher SAT score than is characteristic for the Caucasian kids. The occupational success of that group was spectacularly different from between the East Asians and the Caucasians. 55% of the East Asians were in professional, technical, or managerial positions 20 years after they graduated from high school, compared to 33% for Caucasian kids. Absolutely massive difference in the ability to translate whatever ability the person has into occupational goals. Well, why might this be? See my earlier book on the geography of thought. There are massive cultural differences between East Asian cultures and Western cultures. For one thing, in Confucianism, there's a belief in incrementalism. That is, the way you get smart is by working hard. Actually, Confucius had a clear idea that part of intelligence, as he said, is a gift from heaven, but mostly intelligence that you have is a function of the environment, and you can influence that by working hard, and the family actually demands it. There's a tradition for 2,000 years in China of the poorest kid in the village could become the highest magistrate in the land by study and hard work and taking the Mandarin exams. And they emphasize education. The family has much more power than the immediate family. For that matter, the extended family as well has much more power than the U.S. Mainstream cultures. Okay, well, what are the policy implications of these new set of beliefs I'm encouraging you to have? I think they're enormous. If we want the poor to be smarter, we should make them richer, I think. There are several ways to do that: to increase the earned income tax credit, to increase the child tax credit, to increase the minimum wage. The minimum wage was raised recently substantially in the U.S. from what it had been before. It's now 70% of what it was in 1960. It's lagged very far behind. The U.S. tolerates much bigger gap between middle class and lower SES in all kinds of indicators than Europeans do. So we get what you would expect given that social class difference that we allow to exist. Suppose we had the best available birth to preschool for the neediest, let's say 1/6 of kids. Would that be feasible? What would it cost to do that? About $40 to $50 billion. Or suppose we gave a KIPP-type education for every kid from K through the 9th grade for the neediest 1/6. What would that cost? It cost about less than $20 billion. By comparison, the cost of the post-2000 tax cuts for the richest 1% in this country cost the U.S. Treasury in 2009 $130 billion. And the cost of the AIG bailout was $150 billion. Now, I would love to see this all happen. We don't know that it can happen because we don't know whether these programs will scale up. We don't know if you could take every single inner city school in San Francisco, put them into a KIPP-type mode, and find the same kinds of gains that we find with the KIPP schools. We don't know that. But we won't know if these programs scale up until we try it, and I hope that I've convinced you today it's worth trying it. Thanks very much.